today. What a rich and thought-provoking day it has been so far. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you all back into the room as we take a moment to draw together all of the things that we've learned, all of the experiences and voices that have been brought into this space. And as we prepare to face today's kind of culminating questions, so this final session is about women leaders in society, and we ask, how can faith and government actors increase collaboration? So, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome Sister Helen Alford, who is President of the Pontifical Academy for Social Sciences, Dean Faculty of Social Sciences at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas. Thank you, Sister Helen.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I wanted to start by saying I'm sure you've heard today some wonderful input, and I'm kicking myself that I couldn't be here, but this is quite a nightmare week for me this week. So I'm going to watch everything, the recordings afterwards, but I haven't unfortunately managed to be with you before. So anyway, before lunch, you will have heard some wonderful things about what women are doing as leaders inside the Catholic Church. And then in the second session, what the Church as a whole is doing, as the title of the session said, to foster education, economic empowerment, and skills development of current and future women leaders. Now, it seems to me that the second of these points is particularly crucial for the British and Australian governments. And so, since this session is on collaboration, I'd like to focus my comments on how to build collaboration towards this more general goal regarding women's leadership. And I hope that progress on this front will create a different social environment for the Church too, and could contribute, at least indirectly, to achieving more on the first point too. So the topic of collaboration between governments or international organizations like the UN and the Church, or what can more generally be called faith-based organizations, is not new. In particular, the agreement at the level of the UN of the 2030 Agenda and its 17 Sustainable Development Goals has driven state actors to look for transversal partnerships, since it was clear from the beginning that delivering on goals that they had agreed to, the state governments had agreed to, like zero hunger, SDG 2, or the goal that's most relevant to our topic, SDG 5, achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls, which includes a target, a sub-goal or target, 5.5, ensure full participation in leadership and decision-making. So if you're going to achieve these kinds of goals as state actors, you need transversal forms of coordinated action across many types of actor, including the NGO, the civil society sector, the faith sector, private business, all kinds of actors coordinating their work together to achieving these goals. Now, as we know from history and from Catholic social teaching, this is a kind of experience of solidarity. And solidarity is the key goal, principle, way of behaving and acting that we need to mobilize in the face of injustices and for promoting the good. Now, if we think about how workers in the early Industrial Revolution, confronted by much more powerful employers, how did they cope with their situation and the injustices they faced? They came together and formed labor unions, a kind of solidarity. And of course, perhaps for my generation, the most famous example is the Polish example, actually called solidarity. Of course, it wasn't the only factor that led to the collapse of Soviet communism, but I would say it was a really key factor. It was like a key that opened the door, and especially that the thing could change without violence. If you think of all those decades of the Cold War, we had no violence at the end of the system. That's an amazing example in history of how solidarity works. So I think we can have some hope, because I think a lot of people feel very depressed about the SDGs and whether we're going to achieve them. And if we can really mobilize networks of solidarity, we can really hope that something transformational can happen. So the governments are looking for this kind of collaboration. As a result, we have a lot of research now on how to promote collaboration between state actors and faith-based organizations like the church. I'll just give you one example. The other day, I opened up a 2015 article in The Lancet, so it's looking more at healthcare, with the title, Strengthening of Partnerships Between the Public Sector and Faith-Based Groups. But we could find hundreds of other examples. So it's a very well-studied phenomenon now, how to get collaboration between governments and faith-based groups like the Catholic Church. We also have some government protocols as well. I went online to see if I could find anything, and I had to go back to 2012. Maybe there's something more recent, but I couldn't find it. On the sadly no longer existing Department for International Development of the UK government, they had a document from 2012, so even before the SDGs, which are 2015, with the title Faith Partnership Principles. And that was organized around dealing with poverty reduction. So we've got research, we've got government protocols, and of course we've got a lot of experience, and that's very well represented in the room today. As a final general point, I would say we could see collaboration between national governments and the church as a kind of intercultural engagement. And we could use intercultural dialogue models for building this collaboration. Because while governments and the church may share many overall goals in the area of empowering women, they have their differences, and they certainly have different cultures. So it's a kind of an intercultural discussion here. We have well-developed models we can use to help us promote our shared good without compromising our identities or our values. So with those general things said, I'd just like to think some more specifically about this collaboration between governments and the church on this specific issue of women's empowerment and leadership. And perhaps the easiest way to do it is to look from either side. What could the church do to promote this relationship, and what could the governments do to promote this relationship? Starting from the basic idea that collaboration is favored by mutual knowledge and mutual trust, or what some people in the literature call mutual literacy, knowing each other and trusting each other. Now, most of what I'm going to say is to do with the knowledge factor. It helps to promote trust, but I think trust is a bigger issue than just the knowledge one. And I think the trust one is probably more important than the knowledge one as well, but knowledge is important to help promote trust. So I'm going to focus on that at this point. So from the point of view of the church, how could we share knowledge better? Well, I think we need to get much better at telling our story, as people say, so that people, including other people in the church, know what we are doing. And for me, the most striking example of people not knowing what's going on in the Catholic Church is when Pope Francis was elected. And quite a few of people who are not Catholics came to me and said, oh, Pope Francis has revolutionized the Catholic Church. I mean, he'd only just been elected. He hadn't had a chance to revolutionize anything at that point. But I said to them, no, he hasn't revolutionized it. What's happened is that you see a face of the Catholic Church you never saw before. They didn't even know it existed, this aspect of the Catholic Church, you know? And suddenly it came out into the open. I mean, to me, that's a very telling story of how we don't know very well how to tell our story often. So I want to say, could we imagine something like even a triannual report with a title, something like Catholic Action in Fostering Women's Leadership? You know, this is one of the key ways of getting your message out these days. Governments are producing reports all the time. NGOs are producing reports. Businesses are producing reports. Sometimes they have to do it for legal reasons. They're required to produce these reports. But even if they are doing it for legal reasons, they're also using those reports to tell their story, get their message over, show how they're contributing to society. Now, we're not completely without this kind of report in the Catholic Church. There's one very enterprising individual who is an economist, used to work for the IMF. He now works for UNESCO. His name's Quentin Wooden. And he has so far managed in his free time, using data that's produced by the Vatican Statistics Office, which is brought into them from all the nuncios. They're collecting the data from around the world, and using also sources in other academic research which he could find. He's managed to produce 4 global Catholic education reports so far, and you can find them on a website, globalcatholiceducation.org. He's also produced the first Global Integral Human Development Report. So we do have some kind of reporting kind of capacity in the Catholic Church, but we're not that good at doing it. The best part is the part that's represented here with Alistair and perhaps also Elisa, the NGO sector, and they are doing good reports. I came across something by CAFA just the other day, which I would like to say was founded by women about 60 years ago now. CAFA is the most active part of the Caritas network in UK. And they produced a report in which they talked about 7 ways in which the church contributes to development and emergency response. And I mentioned 2 of the things they said because I think they're relevant to this topic. First of all, influencing norms and behavior, very powerful way the church can contribute to this question. And also speaking truth to power and witnessing and accompanying suffering, also very, very powerful for storytelling as well, getting the message over. So we have some competence, but we could do a lot more. We could maybe create a coalition. It doesn't have to be a heavy organizational structure with a little secretariat that we might have some donors who might fund. And we just produce this report, try to collate information. Which brings me to the second point, generating data that we need to be able to tell the story effectively. We need to promote a kind of data literacy in the Catholic Church, because data literacy is becoming as important as the classic form of literacy, as important as actually reading. Data is becoming a language in which you speak in today's society. If you open those reports I was talking about, they're just full of graphs, tables, all this kind of information based on data collection. And we don't really have much of a culture of it in the Catholic, except in the NGO sector. I'm sure Alistair will give us really good examples what's happening there if he wanted to talk about that. But anyway, he probably wants to talk about something else. Anyway, it's not very widespread, and I often say to people, this is a bit of a slight joke, but still, jokes often give you a message in a different way, that if Jesus had just been alive, and if St. Paul was here trying to spread the message of Jesus like he was in first century Mediterranean culture 2,000 years ago, he would be using data to do it. Just as he used Greek philosophy, which was the best resource at his disposal then, to actually explain the message of Jesus to the society he was in. So we really need to use data, and we can start generating. I do have a good story on this point. I just read an article which came out February the 9th in The Pillar about the Commission for the Protection of Minors. And they were tasked 2 years ago now, 2022, to produce a global report on what's the situation of protection of minors in the Catholic Church. And the person who's leading it, who's this Dutch, very impressive woman, who was former Deputy Secretary General of the Council of Europe and the UN Special Rapporteur on the sale of sexual exploitation of children, so knows what she's talking about in this topic, she's been overseeing the production of this report. And I just give you a couple of quotes from her responses to the journalist who wrote this article about it. In our work, she says, on the annual report, we have been able to explore many of the concerns about the lack of data available and the underlying reasons for this issue. For the Commission to offer the best advice to the Holy Father, it is important to have deep and reliable insights into the state of safeguarding in the Church, which largely depends on being able to collect and collate data. And then she carries on. Even though there might be good practices in some of the dioceses, much of the Church simply does not have the necessary existing data collection systems in place. In many parts of the Church, and especially in the Global South, routine data collection is absent. Many local churches are simply not used to collating and reporting data on a regular basis. And therefore, she says, building data capacity is a persistent challenge that the Commission is trying to address. So I was just thinking, we should be talking to that lady who's trying to do that data collection process for the Commission, because if she's starting to set up a data collection process in the Catholic Church, that data collection process can be used for other things as well, not just for reporting on safeguarding. So last thing I would like to say on part of the church actually contributing to this question is actively seek, especially in the places where women's leadership is very vulnerable and it's a very difficult question, actively seek to partner with embassies and other local government actors to favor collaboration. You know, if the sisters who are here, who've got sisters, you know, in Congo or in Pakistan or in some of these other countries where there's very difficult situation, you know, just go and visit the ambassadors. Just go and say hello, have tea with them, start talking to them, you know. These ambassadors want to do things, you know. Okay, as this one down here, these two sitting in front of me are agreeing with. Okay. So just a couple of words about what could happen from the other side, because obviously I'm less competent on the other side, but I just throw a few ideas out there. What could governments do to promote collaboration with the Catholic Church? I would say one thing that would be interesting to do would be to create an ongoing forum between some part of the home government, probably be Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office in UK and the equivalent in Australia, where you bring in local church leaders and Catholic actors involved in promoting women's leadership. Just start talking about this. If it's difficult to do it just with the church, it could be an interreligious forum. Great, that would be fine too. And we could run a similar kind of forum here at the level of Rome with the relevant Holy See institutions and the embassies to the Holy See, something like this. Second thing I would say, put at the disposal of the Catholic actors on site in key development situations where women's leadership is very, very crucial, the kind of data generation and reporting support that they often lack. And this might be possible to do by teaming up with Christian Aid or CAFOD. Probably this is already happening to a certain extent, at least on development issues, but perhaps it could be done especially to do with the women's leadership issue. Finally, I would say, practice the principle of subsidiarity when it gets to working with the church actors who are in the last mile, as we call it in the development lingo. You know, this is where the Catholic Church and other development actors, civil society actors, are really, really expert. They know what's going on in the ground. The governments don't usually know. And so if you just let those people decide, give them decision-making capability, they will love collaborating with you if you let them decide to do that. Then they have to do the reporting and all that stuff. They have to show what they did. Okay, but if they have decision-making capability, they're the ones who know on the ground what's going on. They know how to use this stuff. Okay, I'll finish there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Sister Helen, for locating us so inspirationally and yet somehow so pragmatically, which is a rare gift indeed, in this kind of final discussion of the day. And thank you as well for highlighting this sense of intercultural dialogue, which I think exists for everyone now who is kind of on this new frontier of collaboration between the church, especially kind of the work of sisters, for example, and the kind of development and policy making worlds. It's such a kind of interesting time to be part of dialogues around mutual literacy and mutual understanding and trust. So I now pass the microphone to Alistair Dutton, who is the General Secretary of Caritas Internationalis. Thank you, Alistair, for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure for us as Caritas, together with the embassies for to the Holy See of the UK and Australia, to be able to take part today and to host the event. It's a bit late in the day to be introducing Caritas, and you've heard from some of the great people around the world who are really doing the hard work. But Caritas is a confederation of 162 national organisations, and we largely mirror the structure of the church throughout the world. So as I say, we've got 162 countries where we have a national organisation. But we work from the level of the national and the capital, the Bishops' Conference, all the way down into the individual parishes and villages. And so we work with government at very local levels, all the way up to working with national governments, and then beyond in the international arena. New York, Geneva, and in some of the capitals around, well, many capitals around the world as well. So I guess I was thinking of a few examples of where I've seen real development in women's leadership, or where we've seen where I've really witnessed women's leadership. And the trouble is the list becomes too long. And I think what we've heard all throughout the day is amazing stories of women who are incredible and are doing amazing things. I've scribbled a few down. There's a woman called Mama Maggie. She's actually called Maggie, but right in Aleppo and during the conflict, who went into one of the poorest Muslim areas as Caritas. Literally the poorest. The people who live in that area are responsible for emptying the toilets, and so the other Muslims don't even engage with them. And these people didn't even know there were Catholics in Aleppo. After 2,000 years of Christianity in Syria, they had no idea there were Catholics in Aleppo. And Maggie led the team into this area of Aleppo, and the debris from the pulverized buildings was all over the place, all over the roads. They literally had to move rocks out of the road in order to be able to get a vehicle in at all. And these people were incredibly frightened, not least because for several years prior to that, they'd been right on the front line of the conflict. So they had been under the artillery fire, but they had no idea who these people were. And when they discovered they were Christians, they had no idea what that meant or where the threat was or anything. But Maggie has led this team, and day in, day out, been in the community, very practical stuff of providing food, clothing, bedding, etc., setting up child-friendly spaces for the kids to play, and helping the community heal as a community. And so now I was just there 3 weeks ago, back with her. I was last with her in 2018, and I was there 3 weeks ago. And she was just there, walking through the community, and everybody calls out to her. And that's the level of leadership and engagement. And that's just one example. I've got hundreds of those. And I won't go through them all. But there's one other which is about, they say the first cut is the deepest. The song says the first cut is the deepest. Anyway, and so forgive me if this is a slightly old story, but one of my first experiences of how to help promote women's leadership was after the Gujarat earthquake. So it was great to have India on the line earlier today. And going into villages in Gujarat after the earthquake that had been completely leveled by the quake. So there were no buildings really above knee height apart from door frames that stood up. And with Caritas India, we started rebuilding 14 of the villages. And as a precondition to engaging in any village, we insisted that there were at least 2 women on every village committee that we would work with. So there'd be 8 to 10 on the committee. Initially, the men weren't having any of this, but we dug in and we held our line. And in one particular, well, in every village, we had 2 women. In one particular village, one of them, who was called Lekki Ben, who was an amazing woman, but initially was incredibly timid. It was hugely threatening to her to even sit on the committee. And the men made it perfectly clear that she shouldn't be there. As she started to grow in confidence, she did start to speak in the committee meetings. And so the men then took her husband aside and said, "Can you not keep your wife under control?" He wasn't even in the meetings, for heaven's sake. But this became, for the pair of them, there was a journey of a good 2 years as she grew more and more in confidence. And at the end of the project was really one of the leaders in that group of 10. But it was a journey of both man and woman together, of husband and wife together, as she grew into what she was capable of, and together they dealt with the flack from the community. He was incredibly supportive, but I know how difficult it was for the 2 of those all the way through. So I think there are those those examples, for us as Caritas, and Patricia was talking about it earlier, we really have looked at the position of leadership that women held. And talking about data, that's exactly what we had, and Patricia was talking about some of those reports. And what you measure, you change. And so as a result of that data, decisions were made that we would actively promote and have women on all of the committees and commissions of Caritas now, including the Representative Council, the Executive Board, and even on the Representative Council, that if we didn't have the right kind of composition, that we would actively co-opt extra women onto the board to make sure that we had the right kind of, the right composition. But then I suppose a question to what can we do together, faith actors, the church, Caritas, together with governments about promoting women's leadership? And in the end, it starts with a personal journey. And so to paraphrase John the Baptist for a moment, this works better in a Latin language than in English. So I'll say it in English first, but it's I must become less, that she can become more. Of course, if you pluralize it, you just get they and they. So in French, ils doivent devenir moins que elles peuvent venir plus. And it's that sense of mutual sharing of power. And so the becoming less is not an abdication, to be absolutely clear. We can't, those who have held power, whatever power it is, but we can't just abdicate that power, but it has to be a commitment to value the skills and talents of all people. Excuse me. And a real commitment that whatever we're doing, we want the best people for the job. And guess what? Very often, that will be a woman. And so we just have to put that out very firmly in front of ourselves. And then becomes a discernment for any job being done, who is the best person for the job? And we should be finding that best person for the job. And then there's something about the courage and humility to cede power. So we can talk about the rational process, but I think in the end, it's about sharing power. And the work of justice is always the work of sharing power. It's about the illegitimate concentration of power being dismantled and power being redistributed in ways that do justice to the dignity of everybody in the room. So I think there's something about the space we create and the recognition we give to women and women's leadership and our willingness to cede power and share. There's also something about celebrating women's leadership, not in some patronizing or pitying way, as has been described at different points during the day. But my wife's an academic, and for anyone who's an academic, writing books is a very long process. So I said long ago, whenever she finished a chapter, we would go out for a very good meal, because you have to celebrate every win. Because the flip side of celebration is building hope. It's only if we celebrate what we've achieved and what we're capable of that we have the strength to go on to achieve more. So I think we need to celebrate and we need to build that hope. We need to look together, and I'm still looking down at the ambassadors in front of me, at how we can promote women's leadership. And it's that ensuring the active participation of all and actively seeking the opportunities to increase the opportunities for women's leadership amongst us all, and having that sharing of opportunity depending on who is the best person for whatever needs to be done. There's also something about women's leadership is we have to back it. And we have to back it with conviction, we have to back it in words and deeds, and also resources. Because resources are about power too, and we have to share and increase power. And finally, I'd say we have to normalise it. Several of the speakers today have stopped and said, why are we talking about women's leadership? The very fact that we have to talk about it means we're not there yet. And we have to reach a point where it is just the norm. And then we can all concentrate on what we want to achieve together rather than having to focus on a fundamental injustice and indistribution of power between us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alistair, for really highlighting the rootedness of the Caritas network around the world and what women's leadership means in those contexts, and reminding us as well of how that rootedness mirrors the real kind of community engagement and rootedness of religious congregations, of course, and of many Catholic institutions around the world, not least educational and healthcare institutions. I think also I was really struck by what you said about the courage to cede power. I think that's such an interesting turn of phrase because the way that we think about courage in a patriarchal world does not tend to have much to do with ceding. And so I think that's a really kind of thought-provoking and valuable turn of phrase to lead us forward. So with that, I'm delighted to turn to Dr. Elisa Chavez, who is a human rights advisor with the Stefanus Alliance International. Thank you, Elisa. Over to you.
Thank you, Julia. And I must just say that doctor title is a bit undeserved. I'm not a doctor, but I'm very honored by the recognition. But yes, my name is Elisa, and I work at Stefanus Alliance International. Stefanus is the Norwegian name for Saint Stephen, who most of you recognize from the New Testament as Christianity's first martyr. We are a Norwegian and Christian faith-based human rights organization, and we specialize on freedom of religion or belief for everyone, regardless of religion or belief, and regardless of gender. For the past 5 years, I specifically have been investing my time in exploring and unpacking the intersection between freedom of religion and women's rights to equality, to better understand how these two rights relate to one another. So I'll use my time today to share on how freedom of religion or belief can be a tool in women's empowerment. For those of you who are not familiar with the concept of freedom of religion, or religious freedom, as it's also often called, it is defined as a fundamental human right in Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And according to the International Human Rights Law, freedom of religion or belief, or FORB for short, it is a bit of a mouthful, so I hope the translators can find a similar acronym. It includes the freedom to have or to change one's religion, and also the freedom to practice one's religion as one sees fit. One would think that freedom of religion or belief for women, or women's FORB, being such a fundamental human right for more than half of the global population, would be an area of significant interest or awareness for those who work either with religion, human rights, or specifically even with freedom of religion or belief or women's rights. But unfortunately, the reality is, as it is with many other areas in society, we know very little about women's experiences when it comes to freedom of religion. And the reasons for why, they are complex and there are multiple. And I'll not attempt to mention them all in this short presentation today, but I do want to give you a couple of concrete examples so that perhaps you can reflect on how to overcome these obstacles in the work that you do, whether that is in a religious space or in a human rights space. So an example from the FORB space where I work is that when researchers, human rights activists, or any other type of external actor approaches a community, a religious community, experiencing pressure like discrimination or persecution, they are often met at the door by the faith leaders of the community in question, in an attempt to better understand and address the specificities of said pressure. So I'm very glad that Sister Helen mentioned the importance in the NGO world of data collection. This is a type of data collection. And in just the past year, we've gotten many examples around the world of persecution of Christians in countries ranging from Myanmar to Nicaragua. So I'd like you to imagine a scenario in which an external actor approaches the Catholic community under pressure. Who would they meet as representatives of that community? Who would they get to speak to? And which perspectives on discrimination or persecution will they get? We know that the vast majority of those holding positions of leadership or power in religious communities around the world tend to be men. And although the malintent is not there to only represent the male experience, the reality is that when religious leaders are men, only men in a community, and they are the only ones given a chance to share their stories of persecution, it easily leads to the invisibility of women's lived realities of persecution. So this way, the external actors engaging religious communities to address or intervene on issues of persecution or discrimination tend to only get what I like to call half of the story, namely the male story of how pressure materializes in terms of actual violations because of religious identity. And that is not to say that men's experiences of religious freedom or lack thereof is any less important than it is for women, but it is important to underline that men's experiences are just half of the story. And the problem becomes when the male experience is presented to be the human experience. The gender differences in how we experience discrimination because of religious identity has also become evident in a new and conscious effort by actors exploring gender disaggregated data when it comes to information and research on violations of religious freedom. And we see now that what has traditionally been presented as typical violations of FORB, of freedom of religion, have actually been typical violations primarily for men. So for those of us who work in the FORB space, we need to invest in more awareness raising and knowledge to better understand the other half of the human story. And we need to understand better women's FORB. This is just one example, but I do believe that it illustrates the gender blindness in intervention on issues like persecution, and that can translate into other spaces of society as it highlights the importance of representation in leadership and the potential pitfalls of not knowing or accounting for the lived realities or needs of a specific segment of the population, and particularly when we are talking about the demographic dimension of the population that women make up, being half of humanity. Going back to the data, according to Pew Research Center, women are also overrepresented in religious communities around the world, and particularly in Christian communities. Their global data collection finds that more than 85% of the world today identify with a religion. And within that, there are approximately 100 million more women than men who identify with a religious identity today. Now, to another reason for why we know little about women's FORB, despite these overwhelming demographic dimensions, can maybe help to answer, or at least attempt to, the question of this panel, namely how faith-based and government actors can increase collaboration on women's empowerment. In the work I've been doing on FORB and women's rights, I've come to understand that there has for long been perceived tension between the two camps of actors working to promote FORB and women's rights, respectively. When it comes to the FORB camp, we see that there is an overrepresentation of religious actors, and this is unsurprising. It's only natural that religious actors have a specific interest for religious freedom. However, we do see that actors in the FORB space, whether they come from religious spaces or backgrounds or the human rights space, they have had a tendency to view women's rights with suspicion or apprehension even. Some see initiatives towards women's rights as a threat to their religious community's resilience or survival. On the other hand, we see in the women's rights space that there is an overrepresentation of secular actors, whether that is secular organizations or secular governments working to advance gender equality. We also see that there is a similar tendency of suspicion and apprehension about the right to freedom of religion or belief, and some views of FORB as an inherent threat to women's equality. But there are good news here. Upon unpacking these tensions, it becomes clear that these views are only based on a number of misunderstandings of how women's rights and FORB intersect. For example, on one hand, some may think that FORB is a threat to women's rights, since we do have accounts of religious actors justifying harmful and discriminatory practices against women and girls on the basis of or in the name of religious freedom. But let's be clear that it is never justifiable to refer to one's own rights for compromising other people's rights. And that is in fact a misuse of the right to FORB. By better understanding the normative framework around FORB according to international human rights law and how this right relates to other rights, we see how FORB can actually provide us with a rights-based approach to protect religious identity and practice, even in the cases where religion is weaponized against women's rights to equality. And on the other hand, some actors will see women's rights as a threat to FORB, since secular actors have had a tendency to be skeptical or negative of religion in a woman's life. But again, let's be clear that this too is a serious misunderstanding of the interconnectedness of the human rights system and how these two rights actually relate to one another. Because on the contrary, FORB can be a tool in empowering women, and specifically religious women, in the work for women's rights, as it creates a more nuanced narrative of the role of religion in women's lives. I'm sure everyone in this room agrees on the fact that religion is absolutely not inherently bad for women. And although cases exist where religion has been weaponized against women's freedoms and rights, it is also a crucial source of identity, belonging, purpose in the lives of the majority of women around the world, and especially when they have the freedom to practice it as they see fit. So, when women are presented with a narrative in which they feel forced to choose between being freed from gender discrimination or being able to practice their faith, they are essentially forced to choose between their faith and their freedom. And that is a violation of women's FORB, and that is a violation of women's right to equality. Investing in women's freedom of religion or belief can open spaces in which both secular and religious actors, both state and non-state, can come together and collaborate on a common cause. And this type of collaboration also expands an extremely important space which has until recently been quite limited on a global level, namely the space for feminist religious actors to have a platform and to have agency to better encourage and support the theological reflections on women's role and value in society as they can exercise their right to FORB. So in conclusion, it is a major and unfortunate misconception of the international human rights system that one right can only be achieved at the cost of another, and the different thematic rights are not a buffet where we pick and choose what we like. It is a system designed for all rights to be interconnected, interrelated, and interdependent. FORB, freedom of religion or belief, and women's rights to equality are therefore not in conflict with each other, but they are in fact mutually reinforcing rights. If anyone is interested in learning more on freedom of religion, speaking of reports, I have with me from my organization, and I have a bunch there if anyone is interested, this booklet. I'll be happy to talk to you after this panel and to share these booklets. And I hope that if you take away anything from this intervention, it is that FORB can be a useful tool in empowering women by both recognizing the fundamental rights of religious women as a necessary part of the advocacy we do for women's equality, and also as protection of the right to have and practice one's religion freely without being able to misuse it for enforcing harmful and discriminatory practices against women and girls in the name of religion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elisa. I think you've articulated a key underlying tension of our discussion today, which is this sense that there are, unfortunately, many spaces in which the balance between promoting faith-based rights or faith engagement and women's empowerment, women's leadership, is some kind of zero-sum game. You know, it's one or the other. And thank you, therefore, for giving us such a clear framework for countering that narrative. I think that's really valuable to us all. I personally dream of a world where UISG and Catholic Sisters are engaging with gender disaggregated data. That will be a beautiful time for us all. So I think before we come to our final conclusions, we have about 15 minutes for questions, for reflections. I'm going to, again, give us 30 seconds to think on that, to pluck up the courage to raise your hands, and then the floor will be open. So I think if there are any questions, our colleagues at the back, yes, we'll be handing over a microphone.
First of all, thank you to this panel and indeed to all the panels for making this such an amazing and helpful day. Having served over 25 years as a chaplain in the National Health Service, one of the things we discovered was the only way to ensure something existed was to make it data. And that was the only way to get funding also, and it was quite effective. But one thing a manager once told me is you're not just crunching numbers, you're telling stories. And my question is, how do we ensure that the stories we tell with our data are ones that are helpful as opposed to ones that people might be able to use to actually wreck our cases sometimes? And I guess, Sister Helen, I'll start with you for that question.
Well, yeah, I mean, I kind of said the easy bit so far about that we need data, and your very good example showed one of the important reasons for it. I often say to people, look, we have to live in the tension between these two phrases, both of which are true. If it isn't counted, it doesn't count, and that's very much what you were saying. But the other phrase is equally true. The things that really count can't be counted. And we need to accept that we're in a kind of a tension about this. I think often people don't understand the goal of data. Data primarily we collect in order to help us improve. I like to say it's more like a walking stick to help somebody who's not very good at walking to go a bit further. You know, it's not trying to explain everything about the situation, because the data you collect is not going to say everything. You have some goal that you want to achieve, and you're collecting data to achieve this goal. If you want to do something else, you probably need other data. You're not making a statement about the whole of the situation that you're in. So this is where data literacy comes in. We need to understand how data is collected, why we're doing it, what it's for. We also need to be able to analyze other people's data. You know, because sometimes people come and say, oh, you know, the church is doing this, or, you know, or something or other they don't like, and they've got some kind of research thing behind. And so the best answer I always say to that is, let me see the methodology. Maybe you're right, but I'd like to see how that data was collected, you know? So it's being able to engage on the data, the data level. And unfortunately, you know, when I was young, and perhaps you're not too much younger than me, we used to say, lies, damn lies, and statistics. We don't say that so much now because we're mostly focused on fake news, you know, and stories being not true. But there is a sense in which data is in our hands. You know, it's a tool. If we want to use it to hide something or say something we shouldn't really say with it, it's not going to stop us doing that, you know. So this is where the kind of things that Alistair was talking about, you know, working at the level of the human heart and at our motivation and our sense of, are we doing something really because we think it's true and we're representing this thing? Or are we just trying to manipulate situations? We can't, the data isn't going to stop you doing that, you know. In that sense, it's a tool like any other kind of tool. Okay.
Thank you very much, Sister Helen. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you to all of you. I have food for thought from all of you. So it's really a practical question, Elisa, when you were talking, and I will have one of the copies, bagged, if that's okay. So I have, on the ground, not data-based, I have come across that cultural and religious reality of fear of the discourse, if you want, about women's leadership, and in light of other religions, because you're going to affect their understanding of their culture and the role of women and the respect. So how do you deal with that, or how do you address it, both in your writings perhaps and also on the ground in your data collection? Thank you.
Thank you. So also just to be clear, so my organization, we don't do a lot of data collection. We rely on data collection by other actors, but we do try to disseminate information and also to present some, for example, these booklets, they're about the standards and the frameworks around international human rights law, which for a lot of religious actors can be very difficult to digest. So trying to disseminate that information and make it practical and useful for religious actors to also use in their contexts, in their spaces. But yes, so I have led for the past 5 years I like to call it a research project. It's not an empirical research project, but more of like a mapping project, where we've done a number of workshops around the world on convening women's rights actors and religious actors and FORB actors to discuss this normative framework around these two rights. And what comes up is that there really isn't a one-size-fits-all solution to your question. Sometimes the change that needs to happen needs to come from within, and sometimes women in that context need to lead that process entirely on their own. Sometimes it needs to be a situation where they actually cannot fit in or find the space for change within the community they are, and they might need support or want support to start a new community outside of that with an alternative interpretation of religious dogmas or texts. So, yeah, I mean, for women, it's often in the Western world, people I've come across, I mean, I come from Norway, it's a very secular context as well. I've encountered many times, like, why don't the women just leave if they encounter so much discrimination and pressure in their own context, in the religious communities? But for the majority of women, I would say, around the world, leaving their local community, it would mean poverty, it would mean loss of custody of children, it would mean loss of inheritance rights. I mean, there's all of these different factors are so entangled. So, yeah, all this to say, I don't think there's really a one-size-fits-all solution. So definitely need to be contextualized, depending the potential or the room for change also. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. But we do have some examples of different ways on this in the booklet. So please feel free to take more than one, because I don't want to bring them back to Norway.
Thank you very much, Elisa. Any other questions, reflections, closing thoughts as we approach the end of this wonderful day? No? In that case, I think we're nearing the very end of this wonderful discussion. So I think before I hand over the microphone for our conclusions, I just wanted to ask you all for a big round of applause for these and all our fantastic panelists today. And also, I think another warm round of applause for everyone who has made this day possible, the translators who I've been seeing there sweating away, the technicians, everyone who's contributed. And now it's my great pleasure to pass the microphone to Ambassador Christopher Trott, the British ambassador to the Holy See, to lead us to our conclusion. Over to you.
Wow, what an extraordinary day. I'd like to start my comments really with a whole series of thank yous. In fact, that's all I'm really going to do, because I'm not sure that I can add any value to the conversations we have just had. First of all, I'd like to thank all our speakers, both those that have been here in the room with us and those that have spoken to us from overseas. I hope none of them were speaking in the middle of the night. I don't think they were. But thank you to them for making this such a rich learning experience for all of us today. And thank you to you, Julia, for chairing us, for looking after us, and for keeping us to time, which I know is quite an achievement. I too would like to thank the interpreters who are sitting up there for their hard work during the day. They must be absolutely exhausted. And I know that on occasions, and I'm afraid I'm not a theologian, I found some of that language quite difficult. How they interpreted that, I'm not entirely sure, but thank you to them. I'd like then to thank, on behalf of Chiara, myself, and Alistair, our 3 teams, most of whom are now sitting up in the back row over there. Thank you all very much indeed. These kind of events don't just happen, and the huge amount of work has been done collectively in preparing for us to have this rich experience. I'd like to also thank on all our behalf the team that's kept us fed and watered downstairs, because without that food we might not have had the energy to engage in this fascinating discussion. And then finally, I'd just like to thank Chiara and Alistair for joining us in this initiative. It's been a really interesting experience to work on this program. I hope you found it worthwhile, and I hope that we will find a way to continue this discussion, not just in terms of Sister Helen's dialogue between government and religious, which is really important, not just in terms of the debate between freedom of not between freedom of religion and belief and women's rights, but all of these rich topics for discussion. I think they're worthy of more time, more energy, and more commitment. And finally, and this is a finally, thank you to all of you for coming here today and joining in this discussion. I look forward to perhaps seeing you again in this kind of context in the future. Thank you very much.